Hello.
Hello.
Hi. How are you, Mr. Azal?
Bismillah. I'm very well. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks especially for taking time out to be with us.
Okay. I should announce that this will be the last podcast for a while. I'll be busy with some stuff for the next couple of weeks, and then the podcast will then resume again after the 20th of February.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay. In the last podcast, we gave a very quick review over, the administration of the Baha'is, originated in Haifa by Baha'u'llah himself, who turned it out, to a criminal organization, syndicate that was involved in many types of, activities such as, racketing, extortion, and even tried of toxic waste, and we also point out, to help the audience understand, the fanaticism laid down by the Baha'i faith, that has come to represent behind, a granite facade of peace and love, masquerading, as a universal religion to preach peace and love, However, Mr. Azal, my first question for you is about a particular incident, that call everybody's attention, after Frederick Glacier, called out the investigative journalists as well as, private detectives, all around the world to go through a cold case, very little about which, had been disclosed, back then. Right. People were surprised to read about Dr. David Kelly's suicide affair. Kelly was evidently an MI6 agent and was converted, to Baha'ism by his girlfriend, May Pederson, who also happened to be a CIA agent.
DIA.
And CIA.
No, DIA. Defense.
DIA agent. Yeah. Right. And a translator, in Iraq, for American Army. Yes. So, would you please tell us a little bit about Dr. Kelly and May Pederson?
Well, let's rewind and go back actually a whole decade. Let's go back to Iran in 1979, 1978 first.
Exactly. So yeah. Mr. Azal, if we are going to start from that point,
yeah.
Let me rephrase my question. Let me ask something else. Yeah. Back in circa 1979 or 1980, right after the revolution, the Islamic Revolution, the first National Spiritual Assembly, totally disappeared. Members of the National Spiritual Assembly, including prominent Baha'is like Dr. Ali Morad Dawoodi or, Pederson-Sadat Milani, all of a sudden disappeared. And nobody ever, came to know about the fate of the very first NSA of Iran after the revolution.
That's right.
However, I'd like to ask you, to give us the detail about the heinous murder of another eminent and outstanding Baha'i preacher by the name of Dr. Daniel Jordan. He was American and allegedly, killed at the behest of another influential Baha'i figure. Could you please fill us about...
Absolutely, with pleasure.
is this incident?
Before I start, I should publicly apologize to Fred Glacier, because back in 1999, when he first raised this issue, I had a back and forth with him on the Usenet group, Talk Religion Baha'ī, about this, and I disputed, his angle on this. But it's subsequently, I found some dissident Baha'i contacts within Iran itself, people who had pretty much gone AWOL from the Baha'i community within Iran itself, and these people were privy to a lot of information. Some of this information was a little off at the time. Nevertheless, I posted something on TRB. I believe it was about 2004 or 2005, a post under the title of The Conspiracy of Silence Between the UHJ and the IRI. Subsequent to this, in intervening years, more details have surfaced about this story. So I'm going to now tell the story with the details that have been filled in. This is the story.
But before you begin,
sure.
Just briefly, I'd like to tell something. The corruption and decline of the Baha'ism under an oppressive administration, founded up at the spurious, fraudulent will and testament of Abdul Baha, a denomination based upon an act of forgery, cannot but produce the many evils, that have manifested themselves.
Well, I would take
increasingly
it back.
The last decade in the Baha'i faith. However, I just like to emphasize on administrative order, that constitutes the real, cadre, for everything that's going on, among the Baha'is. So please tell the story first.
Okay. We have to go back to the pre-revolutionary period, especially the era of the late 60s and 1970s, when the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran, which was headed by the billionaire tycoon Habib Sabet, one of the cronies of the Shah, in fact, the man who had bankrolled Mohammad Pahlavi's stay in Rome in the intervening days before the Mordad, the August 1953 CIA.
Is that the same person, Mr. Azal?
Yes,
is it the same person who is referred to as Pasal?
Yeah,
Sabet-Pasal. But Pasal.
That's him. He's one and the same person.
Right.
He was the Secretary General of the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran pretty much from the period after the August 1953 coup d'etat to towards the end of 1978, or the Rizvan of 1978. So that would have been, April, May of 1978. That's a good, 25 years of serving on that body uninterrupted. But the NSA of Iran, from around the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, had established two trust companies, where every Baha'i in Iran, and this is a period, remember, where the Baha'is are claiming somewhere around 300,000 to 400,000 Baha'is being in Iran. But every Baha'i in Iran was technically a shareholder within at least the first of these trust companies, the sherakat-i-naw nahalan. The sherakat-i-umana was a more elite trust companies, but so these were like private banks in essence, where the community had invested and where the community as a whole were shareholders simultaneously. These are these very weird models of banking and trust companies. Anyway, before the fall of Mohammad Shah Pahlavi's regime, particularly in the late autumn of 1970, as it was becoming clear that the regime of the Shah was teetering and was beginning to falter, this is a story. Now, these need to be at some point. These need to be established by documentation. But the rumors, and I've now heard this confirmed by two completely independent sources, and who are very credible, have said that in this late autumn of 1978, Habib Sabet, just before, I think it was the government of Sharif Imami, closed the banks down so that there wouldn't be a rush to the banks for people to pull their money out of Iran and send their money overseas. Habib Sabet had been tipped off by someone in the royal court that the government was about to do this, and basically took about a little over half of the entire assets of both the sherakat-i-naw and sherakat-i-umana.
So, Mr. Azal, are you suggesting that the whole body of these companies, these corporations, was under Habib Sabet's touch?
Well, this is the question I've had, and this is what I've asked my contacts, to try to establish, because these trust companies have boards, okay, and usually these sorts of decisions are made, by majority decision within a board.
Collectively,
yeah,
exactly.
And there are minutes to these meetings, etc. But they insist that, for some reason, either he had gotten some kind of deputization by these individuals or whatnot, but he took a good half or more of the assets, of the liquid assets, the monetary assets that were deposited in Iranian banks, and took them out of Iran and put them in offshore at the time. So it would have been either Panama or the Cayman Islands, or wherever, and then he settled in the United States. So as the Shah's regime was collapsing, Sabet had essentially taken these monies already out of Iran, according to this narrative. Okay, and so the money was gone, and these
without getting into any kind of trouble.
Well, without anybody noticing at the time, because Iran was in turmoil. So
that's right.
And
yes.
There was a lot of violence, and between the pro and anti-government, the army, and the people in the streets, everywhere throughout Iran at the time. But what these contacts all insist on is that after the Shah's regime was finally toppled and the government of Bazagan was installed, especially from the period right after the referendum of late March, early April 1979, that Habib Sabet made a series of secret trips to Iran.
I see.
And that he had a contact within the Revolutionary Council. Now, in that post that I put on TRB in 2004, I named the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, but according to recent information, the contact that Habib Sabet actually had within the Shura Engalabi, the Revolutionary Council, was actually Mohammad Javad-Bahonar. He was Habib Sabet's contact within this council. So Sabet made these secret trips to Iran, and apparently paid people off, and especially Bahonar himself, and several of Bahonar's own cronies, and then basically began to divide the remaining assets of this sherakat-i-naw nahalan and sherakat-i-umana, between these individuals or whatever cronies or these, contacts that were in Iran, and then taking the rest out of Iran. The National Spiritual Assembly of Iran at the time, which composed people like the father of Keyvan Milani and Ali Murad Davudi, and I believe also Jinus Mahmoudi and some of these women, they got wind of this. They had no idea this was going on, and they got wind of it.
Mr. Azal, I'm going to read off, the list. Abdul Hussein Taslimi, Houshang Mahmoudi, Ibrahim Rahmani, Hussein Naji, Manoucher Ghai Maqami, Atullah Mugharabi, Yusuf Qadimi, Bahiyye Naderi, Kambiz Sadiqzadeh Minari, Yusuf Abbasian, Hishmatullah Ruhani, và Ali Murad Davudi. And I'd like, just to tell the audience that among the demands, put forward by the Bayani communities is the immediate, and unequivocal, surrender in writing of everything,
Yes.
everything regarding the fate of
these
the
individuals.
first, exactly, National Spiritual Assembly of Iran, around 1979, and a complete explanation.
What happened?
With documentation as to the reasons for the conspicuous silence of the so-called Universal House of Justice in the World Fora afterwards, regarding the fate of this body.
Yeah.
Please do go.
So these individuals that you just named, which composed the NSA, National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran, in 1979,
That's right.
Heard about what was happening, and were on the verge of having, just basically, blowing the whistle globally about what had happened here, and this would have created a massive, political turmoil within the Iranian Baha'i community of the time.
So they took notice of that. So they took notice of, that deal between, Habib Sabet.
And
okay.
Ali Murad Dawudi, let me just say this. Ali Murad Dawudi seemed to have had a political rivalry with Habib Sabet for a very long time, and was very antagonistic to Sabet for justifiable reasons. I mean, Ali Murad Dawudi was an academic,
Exactly.
He was in the world of, he was in the world of the university. Sabet was in the world of wheeling and dealing, and and what have you, ties to the royal court and what have you.
And Mr. Azal, he always used to see himself quite superior, compared to Habib Sabet, regarding the academic degrees and stuff like that.
And Sabet and his family were, their corruption was well known. I mean, in fact, one of my great uncles, my father told me these stories about how my father used to write the letters of complaint constantly to the very same NSA, by the way, that Habib Sabet was serving on, complaining about the corruption of one of the sons of Habib Sabet in one of his companies, and the way that this individual was mistreating workers, and especially Muslim ones, and the cronyism and the corruption within some of these businesses that the son of Habib Sabet ran on behalf of his father, and that the NSA of Iran didn't do a damn thing about it, obviously because Habib Sabet was at the head of this organization. So the corruption of the Sabets is well established and now documented beyond even publications that have come out of Iran. So if this story is accurate, that these assets of sherakat-i-naw, nahalan, and sherakat-i-umana were actually pilfered somehow by Habib Sabet, and then the remaining were then shared with his own contacts within Iran, the main contact being Mohammad Javad-Bahonar, then this basically states that Habib Sabet would have been responsible in some way for the disappearance of this NSA of Iran, because if these people were going to blow the whistle on the pilfering of these funds of these share holding companies, then Habib's neck would have been on the line. They could have, authorities would have been able to pursue Habib Sabet in the United States or any other jurisdiction. So he would have had to get up and move and go to a jurisdiction where they couldn't touch him. But instead of doing that, the contacts in Iran believe that Sabet came to an arrangement to have these people basically disappeared. So in a classic mafia kind of tactic
style. And this is beyond the shadow of doubt, right?
Well,
this is beyond the shadow of doubt. You got the deal.
Let me reemphasize this. Nothing is beyond the shadow of the doubt until documentation is in our hands. But these contacts that I have in Iran are, their story, their narrative has been confirmed independently by other people.
And of course, reliable contacts.
And these are reliable contacts. One of whom is Saeed Hajjarian, who is
that's right.
Who's the former intelligence minister who blew the lid off the chain murders, the Qatl-e Zanjiri.
That's right.
And is now a dissident and has been basically pushed out of the system.
That's right.
So this is if this narrative is confirmed by Saeed Hajjarian, the details of it,
a high-ranking intelligence officer, as you
former
said.
intelligence officer who's a dissident now, then this is pretty much good enough for me. But the thing is, and this is what Hajjarian has told our mutual friends, that the actual IRI intelligence ministry wasn't actually set up and established until 1983. So
Right.
any files regarding this particular incident wouldn't exist because the ministry that would have handled it didn't exist before 1983. So in that period of 1979, after the fall of the Shah's regime, this is a Wild West period in Iran. You know, there is no the authority might be the Revolutionary Council, but the real authority is whoever has a gun and whoever you pay on the streets. You know, whoever can wield influence on the streets with the gun during that period. And it was during this topsy-turvy period where these people disappeared for absolutely no reason, particularly given the fact that in March, or actually February of 1979, after the fall of the government of Shahpur Bakhtiyar and the official fall of the regime of the Shah itself, this National Spiritual Assembly of Iran, with the names that you read out, actually sent a congratulatory letter to the Ayatollah Khomeini and Mehdi Bazargan.
That's true.
Okay, so you know, for the narrative that the Baha'is have now subsequently pushed, and which I think a few years ago, even recently, showed up on this hack news site known as Iran Press Watch, you know, trying to blame authorities. Well, you know, Iran is in the middle of a revolution in the point where these people disappeared. Okay, there is no authority in Iran. You know, and this is only like what, about 8 weeks less before the hostage crisis, where the American embassy was occupied. You know,
Exactly.
this is the period that in Iran's history that we're talking about. But these contacts, this recent information that has come to light, sheds a very interesting nuance. And I've also, you know, had this confirmed from other sources subsequently that Mohammad Javad-Bahonar, who served on the revolutionary case, who, by the way, we should mention that lost his life in 1981 in a series of bombings orchestrated by the NSA.
Exactly.
He apparently, in that region of Kerman where he's from, had Baha'i family and had extensive networks of Baha'i contacts himself.
Interesting.
And
Himself,
that
right.
he himself was apparently protecting certain Baha'i, you know, the more elite amongst this Baha'i crowd. Now, this has been, you know, this narrative, this story has been confirmed by a few different sources now. But when we move, you know, now into the 1980s and look at the issue of the murder of Dan Jordan. This is where things get interesting. This is where Saeed Hajjarian actually has confirmed that this information, as far as they are aware.
And what was the whole assessment of Dr. Hajjarian, you know,
Dr.
as
Hajjarian,
a high-ranking intelligent officer?
His assessment was that their assessment, based on information that they had gotten from their interest section in Pakistan, was that the murder of Dan Jordan, the real story behind the murder of Dan Jordan goes as follows. Dan Jordan, a very eminent Baha'i figure, the founder of this ANISA module of education, which is sort of like kind of like a Steiner method, but it's different, went on a trip in late 1982 to New York in JFK Airport and never saw the light of day after that. According to this story by the contacts of Hajjarian, Mr. Dan Jordan had apparently found out about the monies, what had happened in Iran. You know, basically the involvement of Habib Sabet and, you know, the real circumstances about the missing, about the fate of National Spiritual of Iran 1979, and was about to leak this information, whistleblow, and he had spoken to people. And he went he had some business, some kind of a conference or business meeting that he needed to attend to in New York, and on that trip is when he was murdered. According to these contacts of Hajjarian, or the information that Hajjarian had at his disposal at the time, this was also the responsibility of Habib Sabet, that he had contracted the New York Mafia to basically he put a hit on Dan Jordan, because Jordan.
You mean Cosa Nostra, right?
Yeah. That a hit was put on Dan Jordan by the interest of Habib Sabet. Now,
I see.
I should emphasize
see.
that unless actual foolproof documentation, these documents, that Mr. Hajjarian has been talking about, are actually put forward and are scrutinized. This is all conjecture, okay? That
That's right.
However, be that as it may, the inferential evidence, okay, basically makes this story, this narrative, quite credible. That this is what happened.
But one way or another, over the past decades, the Baha'i narrative says something quite contrary, to what you're telling us now, because according to, first of all, I should emphasize again that the Baha'i administration, doesn't really like to, talk about the murder of Dan Jordan. They don't really like to bring it up, And second of all, if you ask, a Baha'i, a typical Baha'i, he will most likely tell you, the official narrative that Dan Jordan was killed by some bystander, right in the street as he was walking the street.
But
somebody.
Here's the problem. Here's the problem with people who actually lived through that era. Who heard the stories. Number one, when the murder of Dan Jordan happened, the first piece of misinformation that the Baha'i community, maybe not officially from the Baha'i administration, but through the rumor mill, was spread that this was a terrorist assassination, that this was done by agents of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that they killed Dan Jordan because he was a prominent Baha'i. Okay, this was the first story. Then this changed. Okay,
then it's changed, exactly.
Then this story changed over a number of years. Then they started imputing to Dan Jordan that he had been a homosexual, and that there had been a homosexual liaison that had gone wrong in New York City. Okay.
Exactly. That's the current official narrative of the Baha'i.
These are misinformation narratives that are put out there to confuse people about what really happened. And when it was because of this particular narrative about this homosexual liaison that was put out that piqued my interest, that there was something quite off about what was going on here. So that's when I started talking to these people in Iran. About what they knew, and then they asked people, and then finally, years later, it came from Sayyid Hajjarian himself that this is the information that they had, that they had established about what had happened.
So, based on this information, these conjectures, and the reliable sources, we can, come to the conclusion that Dan Jordan, was about, to speak up,
Yes.
to disclose, the deal, that notorious deal between Habib Sabet and the mullahs in Iran.
Yep.
And he was, set up and killed accordingly.
Yes. Just as the NSA of Iran itself had been killed as a result of wanting to
exactly
whistleblow on this thing. Yeah.
And they were followed by another body of NSA. Is that true?
The next body of NSA, the one that was tried, I believe it was in 1981 or 1982 that they were finally executed. This is a completely different group of people, and the reasons of what happened to them were quite different as well. These people were arrested at the very time when all these bombings was happening, when there was this internal bloodletting and civil war that erupted between the various factions of the Islamic Republic, or the various factions that had brought the Islamic Republic of Iran to power, namely the Mujahideen Khalq and these various Marxist guerrilla groups, etc. When they went after the Islamic Republican Party, and there was these bombings in the hotel, and Yahya'i was killed, Bahonar was killed. And during this period, it appears that the NSA of Iran, at the time, these individuals were constantly communicating back and forth between Israel and the United States and the UK and all the West all the time. And the regime freaked out about this reality. And just remember, this is the period when the war with Saddam Hussein has also just erupted. Okay, And they arrested these people, and they had a long trial. Now, this 2-hour video that the BBC has put out is a heavily edited version, because the original of this is about 12, 13 hours long, and it's not just one session.
And let me just say here, you know, that the second National Spiritual Assembly of Iran consisted of these people who were detained, you know, and put into interrogation. Mr. Mehdi Amin, Jalal Azizi, Izzatullah Furuhi, Mrs. Jinus Mahmoudi, Mahmoud Majzoub, Qudratullah Rouhani, Sirus Roshani, and finally Mr. Kamran Sami.
That's correct. Yeah, these are the people. Yeah.
Yes.
These, you know, the circumstances of their arrest and trial, etc., were very different to what happened to the National Spiritual Assembly of 1979. Now, the Baha'is, the Baha'i powers that be, you know, the administration, etc., they have spun this and framed this as kind of a continuation of what happened to the one of 1979. Now, these are, in my opinion, and from speaking to quite a lot of people in Iran and elsewhere, these circumstances were quite different. This NSA of 1981 was, in fact, you know, engaging in quite eyebrow-raising activities in the middle of a civil war in revolutionary Iran, and in the middle of a war that had just erupted between Iran and Iraq. So once you contextualize this, and also learn that this trial of theirs was not just a mere 2 hours long, okay, that this went on for 2 or 3 sessions, and that, you know,
so it's longer than that.
Yeah,
video,
it's much longer
right?
than that. Then, you know, whether these people were really guilty of espionage as claimed or not, I mean, one would have to scrutinize the documents, but the documents exist. You know, the charges, the evidence, all of these things still exist in Iran. So, you know, one can go and scrutinize these documents. You know, you have to, unfortunately, go through the whole bureaucratic red tape and rigmarole of the Iranian legal bureaucracy to obtain these documents. But if you obtain these documents, then you could sit down, carefully read, like, for example, through the court transcripts, through the, you know, the evidentiary files, etc. And, you know, you begin to realize that the situation is far more complex and complicated than these, you know, these cute and cutesy sound bites, human rights sound bites that have been pushed through the Western media about this particular case for the last couple of years.
Because on December 6, 1981, 8 of the 9 members of the Second Iranian National Spiritual Assembly, you know, were executed, you know. And when the Amnesty International, you know, called out for protests, you know, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Interior Minister, I myself remember the late Dr. Saeed Raja'i Khorasani, who was serving, you know, as the representative and ambassador of Islamic Republic, you know, at the UN headquarters, telling, you know, the NBC reporter that, yes, I confirmed the execution of members of the Second Iranian National Spiritual Assembly because, he said, in my humble opinion, Baha'ism is not a religion. It is, quote, a political movement primarily created by Russians and then strongly supported and enforced by the British, unquote. Please do go on, Mr.
Well, I mean, be that as it may, I mean, for the record, I'm against death penalties like this, you know, where, you know,
that's right.
You know, I think, you know, we can leave this out there. However, right, without trying to give the benefit of doubt to anyone, I think the activities of this Baha'i administration of that period was extremely foolish. You know, it's as if they were asking for trouble, you know, in a country that has gone through a revolution, is in utter turmoil, is now going through the phase of its internal cleansing or civil war, whatever you want to call it,
Civil war, that's right.
As well as
a
war that is going on. simultaneously.
So the Bayani community, immediately and unequivocally, the Bayani, as you said, were totally disapprove of, this kind of reactions, right?
Yeah, this
They were
killing,
completely
executing people, etc. If these people are guilty of a crime, then you try these people and you imprison them, etc. However, this is a revolution. Let's also talk about reality, okay? This was a revolution in Iran, and it was quite a violent one. And these violent revolutions have a life of their own. It's like a
Exactly.
typhoon, a whirlwind. And so no one can expect that revolutionary forces in a situation that Iran was experiencing, given the fact that it was being squeezed internationally, a war was on its doorstep, internal civil war between the MEK and the regime, etc., was going on. For the you got to ask, how stupid do you have to be if you are a high-ranking Baha'i in an elected Baha'i body, to be calling Haifa all the time or calling the United States all the time.
That's right. That's very mysterious.
In the country
and Mr. Azal, that's fact.
Yeah.
That's fact. However, be that as it may, again, you said the Bayani community unequivocally condemned, the murders of these people.
Yes.
Okay. And something goes. On September 7, 1982, Sayyid Hossein Mousavi Tabrizi, the then revolutionary prosecutor general, officially banned all Baha'i community activities in Iran. It ordered the dissolution of the Third National Spiritual Assembly, and about 400 local, congresses as well. I've got a question for you. Was the second spiritual assembly followed by a third one?
I believe there was a secret and ad hoc because
I see.
Because,
okay.
and I said this for the following reason, because if they had completely disbanded as they were requested to do, then all these arrests that followed in between the years of 1983 to 1985, especially the one in Shiraz, arguably would not have happened. Because once there's no organization, there's nothing for the authorities, the revolutionary authorities at the time, to be worried about. See, this is what is never told to these goo-goo-eyed Baha'is in the West, about these stories. In a revolutionary situation in a country like Iran in the 1980s, okay, this new system in power is extremely paranoid. Now, it's extremely paranoid for a very good reason. It's fighting a war, okay, on one front. There is a war going on another front involving the Soviet Union and its border with Afghanistan. Then, on top of that, there is an internal war with factions within the greater revolutionary movement that had brought this new system into power, that are fighting the new system. That they fall on a foul with each other, and so this paranoia by members of the system when a cult or an organization with an international presence, and especially as headquartered in Israel, okay. And these people were asked, and basically, demanded that they disband their organizational apparatus. And they said, okay, and then they're underground continuing with all of this.
Exactly, because they time and again, Mr. Azal, time and again, the Baha'is, the Haifan Baha'is, asserted that, the third NSA in Iran voluntarily dissolved, which is suspicious, which is kind of fishy and phony claim, in my opinion, because, over time, several members of the Third National Spiritual Assembly were again arrested, and interrogated by the government, That's well documented, you know?
Yes, yes. So yeah, this narrative doesn't make sense. There were activities, and especially in that period.
It doesn't add up.
In about 83 to 1985, especially that whole incident in Shiraz, where that girl, Mona Mahmoudi Nejad, was taken. They made a great, they made a huge brouhaha and story and Joan d'Arc kind of story out of her situation.
Could you please briefly touch on this incident of Mona Mahmoudi Nejad?
Off the top of my head, she was a what they call a Dars Akhlaq teacher, a Baha'i indoctrination for children class.
She was hardly 18 years old,
And she was barely 18 years old. She was probably about 16 years old. And apparently the Revolutionary Council, or I don't know what they were calling it at the time in Shiraz, but of Shiraz had several times warned the Baha'is, and especially this girl particularly, to cease and desist the activities of these Baha'i children's classes, because this has also come right after the so-called Third National Assembly had been asked to disband, and they had agreed to do so. But that these children's classes, these propaganda, these Baha'i Dars Akhlaq classes were still ongoing, and they, these.
So they continued no matter what.
Yeah, and this was all usually under the aegis of a National Spiritual Assembly, teaching these children's classes, children's indoctrinations classes. And finally, these sort of ad hoc Baha'i communities that were also operating underground amongst the Baha'is of Shiraz, they came and arrested all of these people, including Mona Mahmoudi Nejad, and there was some...
His father, her father
as well. And they were executed. The mullah.
And you're talking about the time around 1983, right?
83, late 1983, 1984 or so. Yeah.
Okay.
And
you go on.
These people were executed. Apparently, the religious judge in question, was quite a hard ass. And I've heard this from several different people that this guy was just a nutcase. You didn't ever want to appear in a court with this guy. But what is especially alarming about this story is that, if the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran at the time had been asked to disband by the central government, and they had said okay, and they disbanded, why were these other activities like the one in Shiraz still ongoing? If you disband your administrative apparatus, that means that all of these things are no longer... I mean, look, the regime...
That's paradoxical.
Yeah,
that sounds paradoxical.
The regime would have had no problem if these people gathered and just said prayers, whatever, sit in your homes and, gather even in your homes, whatever, and say your prayers. We don't care, okay? But it was it was this specific kind of, the children's classes, committees, this sort of thing. This is organization. This is political, but they never tell you this side of the equation when you hear these stories from the Baha'is. And putting a 16-year-old girl, in harm's way by these, sort of ad hoc Baha'i bodies in a post-third NSA of Iran period is just criminal. This girl should have stayed at home or gone to school and lived her life without getting involved in these sort of activities. You want to be a Baha'i? Okay, be a Baha'i. Read your prayers at home, have your 19-day feast at home, do your thing at home, You're living in a hostile environment, okay? Doesn't Baha'u'llah talk about the employment of hikmat, or wisdom, the Baha'i version of taqiyya?
Exactly.
But, these people were, it was as if the international Baha'i bodies, and particularly the Universal House of Justice, at the time was itching to have martyrs in Iran.
So they wanted you believe they wanted to exploit, a mass murder of, the Iranian Baha'is.
And using the Iranian Baha'is, their own flock, their own membership as into that
as a testimony of, the suffer they've gone through.
I have evidence of this. Because granted, I was a child during that time, a young adult, barely a teenager. But I remember very clearly when these letters in Farsi from the Universal House of Justice would come to the Iranian Baha'is living overseas, and they kept on insisting to the Baha'is of Iran, istiqamat konid, bear it.
Stand and fight.
Yes, stand and
fight.
Konid. This was the answer coming from Haifan. What kind
and
of
is that true, Mr. Azal? Is that true that the Universal House of Justice, the main mafia body of the Baha'is, permanently, and perpetually, dissuade the Baha'is, from leaving Iran for European countries?
Yes,
or
they
elsewhere?
were. They were dissuading. There was a period where if any Iranian Baha'i got into the airport at Mehrabad and flew out of Tehran and came to a third country, they would be immediately excommunicated. And the reason is following: because at the time in Iran, there was a requirement. There was a religious section of the form of your exit form, where you had to write that you're a Muslim, Christian, Jew, or Zoroastrian before they would let you out of the country. If you wrote Baha'i, it would create a problem because Baha'ism was not a recognized religion under the Iranian constitution. So, a lot of these Iranian Baha'is wanted to get out of Iran, wrote Muslim. So what? This is hekmat. Baha'u'llah's hekmat, right? But the Universal House of Justice didn't like this, so it ordered all of its NSAs in the West, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, etc., that any Baha'i who came out of Iran through Mehrabad Airport would immediately lose its voting rights. They excommunicated these people.
And at the time, Mr. Azal, Mary Maxwell was still alive,
Yes.
and orchestrating nearly almost everything, because I came across a passage in Mirza Kamali's memoirs that some of the Baha'is, who had succeeded in, fleeing Iran for America, or Canada, started protesting about the situation and circumstances of, the Baha'is in Iran. And he said, Ruhiyyih Khanum, let's say Mary Maxwell, Ruhiyyih Khanum just shrugged and said in Farsi, Man harfamo goftam, I've expressed myself, that the Baha'is of Iran should stay in Iran, stand and bear, all the sorrows and agonies, and sufferings.
She said this.
My word.
She also said this. I was a child in Los Angeles in 1980. In the winter of 1980, she came to Los Angeles and had a speech for a group of Iranian Baha'is, where she also insulted quite unequivocally. At the time, everybody took it as a joke and laughed. I was in the front row at the time. I was about 8-9 years old. And she basically said this stuff. Amin Bannoni was also her translator. And I never forget my father that night when we returned from this convention with Ruhiyyih Maxwell back home. He was very angry. And years later, I asked him about this. I said, why were you so angry that night when we came home? And he said, you know what? This woman, she was standing there with just ultimate chutzpah, telling to the face of all these Iranian Baha'is that all of their relatives who are still stuck in Iran should stay there and bear all the agonies and all the travails of what's going on in Iran. Why the hell doesn't this woman herself get on a plane and go to Iran and experience the travails and the burdens that these people are going? Why is she encouraging these people to stay in Iran?
Exactly. And Mr. Azal, it's very interesting because Iraj Khodadoost, Dr. Iraj Khodadoost also posted a video on YouTube that corroborates, your story. He said, we had a meeting with Ruhiyyih Khanum, and she replied with her, American accent in Farsi, with her sweet American accent in Farsi. that شما ایرانی ها فقط میخواین دور هم در شهرهای بزرگ جمع بشید و قرمه سبزی بخورید. In English, you Iranian guys just want to gather together in order to have delicious dishes, Iranian delicious dishes, and talk things through. They don't care about promulgating of the faith. They don't care. You don't care about the faith.
I mean,
that's what Iraj Khodadust also said. A prominent Baha'i.
I don't even know what to say to that. I mean, this woman's entire livelihood in Haifa.
He developed a hatred for the Iranians.
Yeah, she had it. I never forget. She said this. She said with her American accent. I'm speaking Farsi. She said, "Shoma Irania as chale Tehran amadin be chule Los Angeles." You Iranian Baha'is have come from the deep well of Tehran and to the even deeper well, jumped into the deeper well of Los Angeles. And then she goes on, "Mage shoma kharid." Just like that. Are you stupid? Are you donkeys?
Are you donkeys? Yes.
I was there. I was 9 years old.
So she used to address the Iranian Baha'is with pejorative terms.
Yeah, and all these Iranian Baha'is would laugh. Oh, beautiful Khanum, she's so funny. My father was furious, and years later I asked him, this woman was a complete, I don't even know what to say. And
Mr. Azal, at the time, other Iranian prominent hands like Furutan and Faizi were also alive.
Yes, they were still alive at the time. Yeah.
Totally, they totally turned out to be proponents of Ruhiyyih Maxwell and whatever she decreed, back then.
Yeah, I mean, she was, like I said in the last podcast, she was the matriarch. Basically, the
matriarch. She was like an underboss, yes.
Yeah, she was the de facto matriarch of the Baha'i faith. The Universal House of Justice at that time was effectively the basic, the CEOs of the company, and Ruhiyyih Maxwell was the kind of de facto female guardian of the Baha'i faith. But
because as you said, probably positively, she expected the Iranian Baha'is, who somehow succeeded in, escaping Iran, escaping, the firing squads or, interrogation, jail and stuff like that, fleeing Iran for America. She expected them to deploy, themselves to remote villages, to remote places, without any sort of significant facilities, without basic goods, solidly.
Yeah, she was an advocate of outposts.
To promulgate.
Yeah, outpost pioneering. So she was encouraging
exactly pioneering.
These Pahlavi era, nouveau riche bourgeois Iranians from North Tehran.
Exactly.
To immigrate,
exactly. They couldn't afford.
To immigrate, go to, Africa. I mean, in some sense, I wish they had done that because it would do them a world of good. These people were over pampered and what have you. But this is the mentality. It was a kind of a mentality of we have to, basically establish our presence everywhere throughout the third world.
Is that true? Is that true that nevertheless they were mostly deployed to those remote regions, remote and very, very less down regions, equipped with almost nothing, edible water, or even electricity, running electricity and stuff like that, just to do pioneering. What is the meaning of this pioneering?
It's just another way of saying proselytizing and missionizing. So she was basically she was taking the model of Christian missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant in the third world, and wanted to make a Baha'i version of this. So that then you have
because the Baha'is say we don't process lies.
Well, this is an etymological issue rather than an issue of fact.
Right.
But yeah, this is what they were doing. So they want their presence everywhere. So they would go to these remote islands in Micronesia and Polynesia. They establish these things and teach these islanders. Apparently, in one of these Samoan islands, they had managed to convert the chieftain who they claimed to be a king, and on it goes. All parts of remotest, parts of Africa, whatnot. Now, I have always had the question, is that these people that they have claimed to have taught in these parts of the global south, do they really understand what this organization is really about? Do they understand what they were signing? What kind, what was this all about? I don't think so. I don't think these people really understood what they were doing, which in a sense tells you the kind of manipulative mentality that exists in the Baha'i administration about proselytizing itself, and to these global south. It's a colonialist kind of mentality. We want to establish a presence, but we do it on the excuse that we want to convert people in this global south to our creed, right?
Speaking of established presence, what is your assessment, Mr. Azal, of Juan Cole's article, in which he says very clearly that the influx of Iranian Baha'is, the massive immigration of Iranian Baha'is to the United States in the post-revolution era brought about fundamentalism, into the Baha'i community. He said one of the elements, one of the quintessential elements is the influx of the Iranian Baha'is.
I think the argument is nonsense. I told this to Juan Cole to his face at the time. Because there is a very conspicuously Anglo-Saxon form of Baha'i fundamentalism.
Because sorry, Mr. Azal, he says just to rephrase his argument, in that article, he made a case that most of the American Baha'is were coming from a high middle class background, but and therefore they used to carry an era of moderation, an era of intolerance, an era of tolerance and liberalism.
You know what? This is a classic liberal fallacy, American liberal fallacy. This is what really bothers me about these people, because this is actually a form of racism. It's a very classic form of Anglo-Saxon, liberal racism.
Because Mr. Azal, he continues.
Let me hold on. I've read the paper. I know what it says. Let me finish.
Please go on.
What Juan Cole is arguing, which is completely a civilisé argument. That us liberals are enlightened. We are tolerant. And look at these, backward or recently civilized Iranians who are coming to our country, and they have brought this, fundamentalist zeitgeist with them to our country. When that's actually not the case at all. Fundamentalism, American white Anglo-Saxon Baha'i fundamentalism, has existed in the Baha'i community as long as the Baha'i faith has been in North America. Evidence of this is in the Chicago Reading Room affair of the 1920s. Evidence is this in the career of people like Horace Hawley. Evidence is in the circumstances of the schism that happened when Khairullah came back to the United States.
So you mean, Mr. Azal, do you mean that's the case as far back as the first American citizens,
absolutely,
converted to Baha'ism?
There has been this tension. There has been this tension of fundamentalism or cultism. I don't even use that word, fundamentalism anymore. This is cultism. The cultist mentality, the reactionary cultist mentality of Baha'ism has existed in an Anglo-American form from the very inception of the Baha'i faith, and it has been as much. What I'm arguing is that there are cultures of fundamentalism. It's not just reducible to Iranians because they come from a Muslim background. They have brought fanaticism and fundamentalism. This is racism.
So you believe that fundamentalism, was not at all conceived by, the massive immigration of Iranians?
Absolutely. This is
racist.
This is what
very racist.
What Juan Cole, this argument that Juan Cole made in that paper is a version of what Donald Trump is saying today. about immigration to the United States. It's just that Juan Cole said it in the 1990s with a, as a academic liberal, and Mr. Donald Trump is now saying it as a crazy GOP figure of president of the United States. These arguments are exactly the same. But this is the thing about the liberals, the liberal faction of the Baha'is. They're all predominantly white, okay, most of them. And they all are Islamophobes to the last man, okay? And, where the Iranian community is concerned, as long as I remember, there has always been a tension between these white Anglo-Saxon Baha'is, liberal Baha'is, and the Iranians. And it doesn't matter how liberal it is that these Iranians become, these white Anglo-Saxon liberal Baha'is look on these Iranians as the other, okay? They demonize them. They're always suspicious of them for being, coming from this Muslim, this Muslim Shiite culture, etc., etc. So Juan Cole's entire argument in that paper rests on this fallacy, And fortunately, the book that Joseph Massad just recently published a couple of years ago, Islam in Liberalism. When I read that book, it didn't come as a revelation, but he basically unpacks this entire this kind of zeitgeist, the kind of zeitgeist that the liberal Anglo-American Baha'is pushed in regards to the Iranians. They don't like the Iranians,
And do you agree that his dismissive tone, although the article is quite, upsetting?
It's, upsetting or not, but it reveals that Cole is just, the Tweedledum liberal to the Tweedledummer of his GOP conservative, brethren in the United States, who have almost identical views about these issues. This is. And
he was also a supporter of Hillary Clinton, by the way.
And he was also a Clintonian. He was, pushing Hillary Clinton quite heavily. So, to me, at the time I tried to understand this argument, but, one good thing about deconstruction, and especially in race theory, people like Charles W. Mills and whatnot, that open your eyes. When you read critical theory, they unpack these things very well, and they let you look at the social forces and the assumptions and the subtext and whatnot that are animating these people. And this is one of the reasons I broke with the Baha'i liberals, because these people are racists. Who interrogated Juan Cole? Was it an Iranian? It was Stephen Birkeland. Stephen Birkeland is a white guy, not an Iranian. Was it an Iranian that wrote that letter that kind of demonized the talisman list? No, it was Ian Simple, a Brit, an Englishman.
That's right.
So
he was an Englishman.
So this thing, what you just underscored about that article of Juan Cole, it also demonstrates a long-standing tension that has existed, at least in the Five Eyes countries, the Anglo-American countries where Baha'ism has established itself. This tension between the Iranian Baha'is and the white Anglo-American Baha'is, and these two cultures.
Cool. Okay, Mr. Azal. So, if you please, let's jump from 1982 over a decade later.
Okay.
This is another fascinating story, another cold case, that's never been discussed, that's never been, thoroughly examined, as much as it deserved. One of the demands against put forth by the Bayani community was, quote, the immediate and unequivocal disclosure of all documents and papers regarding the suspicious murder of one Hedi Moani in New Zealand, unquote. Would you please tell us about this heinous murder that took place in New Zealand? Please do go.
I believe it was around 1995, 1996 or so, that Hedi Moani, the youngest brother of Jamshid Moani. Jamshid Moani was a very prominent Baha'i travel teacher to Indonesia in the 1950s and 1960s. As a result of certain experiences he had, he suddenly decided that he was going to announce himself as the manifestation of God that comes after Baha'u'llah. And he wrote a whole bunch of works in the very same stylism as Mirza Hossein Ali Nuri, which is actually not a great style, if you ask me. He was excommunicated when he came back to Iran, but his parents actually followed him, which is quite interesting. This family ripped apart. One section of the family remained staunch loyalists. Yahya'i Moani, who actually used to live here in Europe until about, I think, 2012, was a counselor so he was a staunch loyalist. And then Hedi Moani was the youngest brother. There are a couple more brothers and sisters around, but Jamshid Moani...
So far you said Jamshid Moani, conspicuously made a claim,
yes.
as a new man Yusarullah.
Yeah. But not
God shall make manifest.
Obviously not the man Yasarullah of the Bayan, because the man Yasarullah
of course
of Mr. Hossein Ali wasn't the real one to begin with. But Jamshid Moani was the man Yasarullah of Hossein Ali Nuri.
Mr. Azal, back in because the Baha'i administration was surprisingly very quick to blame again Muslim fundamentalists of the regime, for the murder of Hedi Moani.
Well,
and you told me privately, that this time Dr. Said Hajjarian, was totally in possession of all documents, because the Ministry of Intelligence has been established probably
at that
for
point,
a decade. At that point, that was fully established, and you told me this time he had much more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, through our mutual contact with Dr. Hajjarian, our mutual contact told both of us that basically what the information that they had gleaned about the death of Hedi Moani, but that this was also an internal job. But this time that they had, now this is where this gets a little murky for me, because there's
please do tell the story completely,
sure.
According to what Dr. Hajjarian and others say.
Okay, the story is as follows. The story is that Hedi Moani, during the hiatus period of Jamshid Moani's life, at this point Jamshid Moani was in Iran, had been pressed on by the Universal House of Justice and also the National Spiritual Assembly of New Zealand to publicly renounce his parents and his brother. It's something that he had never done. Now, Hedi Moani was quite an active Baha'i. He had, I think, either served...
And he was a former member of the NSA of New Zealand.
Yeah, he was a former member of the NSA of New Zealand. He was active in a lot of these talk circuits, amongst these people. I actually met him at the end of 1994 at the wedding of my cousin. He was invited to it, and on the Gold Coast in Australia. I'd come to visit from the United States. I was at university at the time, and I met him, and I thought he was a very nice man, very sweet man, a little bit radical for most conventional Baha'is. But then, not too long after that, I think it was about late 1995, 1996 or so, we suddenly heard the news that he had been murdered in his home. And the initial story that was put out is that there was some guy, he was a Maori, and that this Maori belonged to some local religion, and looked at Hedi Moani as a sort of an antichrist figure, and then basically took him out in his own home. Then, now we're hearing, at least this is the story that our contact has gotten from Said Hajjarian, is that in fact there was no Maori. This was not a Maori at all. This was an individual that was apparently well known to the Irish Mafia in New Zealand, and that somebody had contracted the Irish Mafia in New Zealand and put a hit on Hedi Moani.
Whoa! Whoa.
And the speculation is by Hajarian is that this goes back to the Universal House of Justice.
And just due to his refusal to publicly curse and renounce his parents and his brother.
This was a big deal to them, particularly because at that very time, or shortly thereafter, there was a woman in New Zealand who was publicly excommunicated because I think one of these excommunicated Afghans from the time of Shoghi Effendi had settled in New Zealand, and this Baha'i woman had become friends with her and refused to cut her friendship off with this woman, with this Afghan, and she was excommunicated. We heard about this case on Talisman at Indiana EDU. So this murder of Hedi Moani came at the same time. I guess the assessment was that if there were all these quote-unquote covenant breakers and these relationships forming between rank and file members and the quote-unquote covenant breakers, that the administration and the tenuous hold of the administration in New Zealand would have, basically they would have lost control of the situation. And this is how silly and crazy and at the same time criminal this all is. People associating with each other, and a big fish like Hedi Moani refusing to renounce his family, who have been declared covenant breakers. All of a sudden, there's a contract out for this guy's life. Now, again, I emphasize that all of this, until the actual documentation, intelligence documentation, one day surfaces. These are conjectures, but however, the source from which the conjecture comes from is of quite a credible source, particularly given the fact that this is the same source that leaked the chain murders,
Exactly.
So,
and Mr. Azal, the other day you also told me, in a private conversation, that Dr. Hajarian also believed that, they did this dirty job in order to convey a message, to Jamshid Moani, to keep his mouth shut.
This is basically what our mutual contact conveyed to us, that because Jamshid Moani was beginning to become active again for some reason. And this was a way to basically send a message to him to shut up, quit your activity.
In a mafia style, right? Mafia style. And what happened to Jamshid Moani, afterwards?
I heard he died, I think about 15 years ago now. I heard that he passed away in Iran.
And no activity emerged, from his party and his companions?
No. I do know of individuals, in fact, a very eminent developer on the Gold Coast in Australia, his father, late father, was the individual deputized by both the UHJ and the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran to do the initial interview with Jamshid Moani when he came back from Indonesia making his claims. So some of the works of Jamshid Moani, his so-called revelatory works, were in the private possession of his family. And I had seen a few examples of this, or been told about these writings and how his style of writing was so similar to that of Baha'u'llah, Mirza Hossein Ali and Nuri's, and that he was basically doing the same kind of thing, but minus any kind of ridiculous kind of book of ahkam of the kind of Baha'u'llah had, So it was like
they succeeded in silencing,
So he was a Baha'u'llah minus the Kitab al-Aqdas. Basically, this is what he was marketing himself as, Jamshid Moani. He had
and therefore could we conclude that by perpetrating this heinous murder, the Universal House of Justice actually received what it was after,
hold on, let's just emphasize that
and pushed him out of the business.
Yeah, these are who is responsible here. We are conjecturing. Okay, we have to emphasize this for legal purposes. We have to emphasize that we are conjecturing based on anecdotal evidence that has been given to us through a contact by an extremely credible source. So, let's just basically.
But logically speaking, it makes sense. Logically speaking,
it completely makes sense. It completely and totally makes sense. But let's just put this out there. If anybody is listening from law enforcement, especially law enforcement in either New Zealand or the United States, okay, I believe it behooves the law enforcement agencies in these two countries, especially the New York Port Authority, to reopen the case of Dan Jordan. Okay, they claimed that the case went cold. The FBI's files apparently say that this is a cold case, but based on this anecdotal information that we have put into this podcast, okay, if there is law enforcement listening to this in the United States, okay, in New Zealand, that they should maybe follow these leads and see where these leads go, okay?
And what matters here actually was your own testimony, because you said just a couple of minutes ago that you met Hedi Moani in person, right?
Yes, I did.
Because the Baha'is official narrative, is as follows: Hedi Moani got into an altercation, with some guy, and got killed. But you're saying, Mr. Azal, that he was such a nice guy, not the kind of person to get into altercation,
Anybody can get into an altercation, but the issue is, let's not psychologize the guy, okay? The first set of circumstances that were told to us was that, there was a Maori, okay? This is what really bothers me. They said that there was a Maori, one of the indigenous people of New Zealand, who looked at Hedi Moani as a rival to the growth of his indigenous religion and killed him, okay?
Whoa, that's nonsense.
That in a sense turned out to be nonsense, and the people that put this story out were complete, the racism is just unbelievable. Then they later put out another story, and now we're hearing another story that in fact this was a white guy, and a white guy that was apparently, according to the sources that Mr. Said Hajjarian has gleaned, was basically set up by the Irish Mafia. It was a hit job, basically.
It was a hit job, yeah. And from the point onward, the Dunedin police, the residents of Hedi Moani, announced this murder as a cold case. Is that true?
That's the only information I know. Well, not a cold case. They caught the guy.
They caught the guy. Yes.
There was a trial. Apparently.
And by the way, the woman you just mentioned was Marshall. Was Sarah Marshall? What was her name that you said? Another Baha'i living in New Zealand, who was excommunicated.
I don't remember her name. I have notes on this, hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes on all of this.
I see.
But yeah, there was a woman who was excommunicated because she was associating with one of these quote-unquote old covenant breakers. I totally detest that term. As if the Baha'i, the so-called Baha'i covenant has any legitimacy at all, whereby you label people breakers of that covenant.
So breaking the covenant, will have dire consequences. Yeah.
Well, look, this woman was associating with an old generation CB, and they excommunicated because she refused to cut a relationship. It was just a relationship. Two human beings.
Sorry, what you are talking about Alison Marshall, right?
No, I'm not talking about Alison Marshall. This was a New Zealand woman who had befriended or the child of one of these old families, whether it was Afnan or one of the families of Baha'u'llah or even
Shahid. Right. Yeah, I remember. Exactly.
And this was a white New Zealand woman with this Iranian woman, who was the Baha'is considered a covenant breaker, and the National Spiritual Assembly and the UHJ warned this woman that you need to break your friendship. She refused, so they declared her a covenant breaker.
And is that true? Is it again true that Professor Moshe Sharon, against all odds, surprisingly stated that, at the time being, for the moment, no single person from the descendants line of Baha'u'llah is living on Earth. Is that true? Because
he said this point blank to Nama pirates.
Why would he said that? Why would an Israeli, definitely not a Baha'i, want to say such a thing?
Allahu Alam. God knows.
God knows.
But I think we can speculate that he was the head of the Baha'i chair at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem for I think a decade, maybe longer. Hold on. This chair was endowed by the Universal House of Justice. So the money for the creation of that chair that Moshe Sharon served on came out of the paycheck of, basically it was the money of the Haifans. So this is a great public service that Nama Pyrus and Asif Shafir, who made the documentary, the mockumentary Baha'is in My Backyard, did. If nothing else in that piece, is that they showed that this guy was a liar.
Yes,
because,
and that's what I'm asking, Mr. Azal. We are living in internet era. We are living in information age. But he should have known better. He should have definitely known better.
He didn't.
But saying,
and he was shown up. I mean, this guy,
they are not families.
Yeah, they were saying, he had written this book, probably one of the only books in Hebrew that was published in Israel. About the Baha'i faith, and basically made this claim in the book. But Nama pirates and Asif Shafir, they went and found this family, and in Haifa, not too far away from the Baha'i World Center itself. And it turns out that these people were, they'd been there. This Nagar Baha'i was married to an Israeli man. Her children were
Mr.
married.
Ansel, yes, Nagar
Ansel Baha'i,
yes.
And so, you got to ask yourself, why would, but this is the thing. I mean, Nama Pyrus basically said this to me in email that, most Israelis, average Israelis, have no idea what these Baha'is are about at all. And that's
right.
That maybe until recently, the age of mass communication, almost probably you could count on one hand the number of Israelis who could actually tell you what these people really believe, what they were about, what their history was, and this cloak and dagger policy that the Israeli state and the UHJ together have pursued against even the population within Israel itself is quite bizarre. We saw that in the segment of Baha'is in My Backyard where they go to the department of where they keep all the city plans and for structures and whatnot. And this town planner guy hadn't even seen the plans for this Haifa Disney complex.
He detected the bunker, right?
Yeah, and he found that bunker, and he's like, these people are crazy. Yeah, these people think that there's going to be a global, some kind of global Armageddon, and these guys, go and hold themselves up and emerge as the saviors of the world.
Probably that's due to the messianic, beliefs.
This Israeli city planner was just like, and you watch this documentary, and this guy's mind was just blown, and these are people who live in Haifa,
exactly.
Had no idea what was going on, and one thing that is very conspicuous as a narrative within Baha'i in My Backyard, even though they don't actually say it, is that the UHJ is given allowances over and above almost any religious organization in the Holy Land. Okay? The kind of allowances that they got to build this megalomaniacal hanging gardens of Babylon on Mount Carmel, you don't find any Jewish group that has been given that kind of allowance, I mean, certainly the most powerful of these Orthodox Jewish groups in Israel, like the Lubavitchers, haven't built themselves anything like that in Israel. And
that being said, Mr.
So, what is going on? I mean, this is, and it is only in the interviews, the segments of the interviews that Frederick Glacier uploaded from the entire interviews that he did with Mama Pirates, where she actually says this outright. And I think it's in the second hour, where she says that, we don't understand, these guys, this UHJ Baha'i organization has an intimate relationship with governments, and it's just like, closer than anybody else's, What is this all about?
What is this all about? And Mr. Azal, it is very interesting because upon the premiere of, this documentary, I believe in Australia, so many Baha'i, got upset, They started addressing, the moving as a malevolent, devil attempt to demonize the Baha'i faith, and
I don't think it went far enough. I don't think.
But
it went
exactly.
far
But
enough.
I want to ask you another question.
Sure.
Let's go through another cold case. Again, about which very, very little we've known so far, and very, very little has been disclosed so far. Because I myself was surprised, to read about David Kelly suicide affair.
Yeah.
As I said, Kelly was apparently an MI6 agent,
Yep.
and a weaponry observer working for the government, and he was, according to the testimony of the England NSA, converted to the Baha'i faith by his own girlfriend, namely
Maya
Pederson-Sadat, who also happened to be, an agent, a spy, and officially working as a translator in Iraq for American Army. Would you please tell us about this suspicious case?
You basically said it all. David Kelly was a weapons inspector and part of the British diplomatic corps of weapons inspector working for the United Nations, as well as the British government. Anybody who knows anything about how the diplomatic corps works with the Brits knows that you cannot be part of any kind of a diplomatic corps, whether for the UN or otherwise, unless you're MI6. That is well-known information, been cited, written about copious times. He went to Iraq, did the inspection. In fact, this man had a conscience, and realized that, that the Yanks, the Americans, had an agenda, that they wanted to do this, and that there was no evidence for this. His handler from the American side, from the Department of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA of the Pentagon, was this Mayas Pederson-Sadat, who was a Kuwaiti translator and agent for the Pentagon, DIA.
I see. So she was originally Kuwaiti, not American.
Yeah, she's Kuwaiti, originally Kuwaiti. And just then after the invasion of Iraq, sometime afterwards, following a commission where he gave testimony, he was found dead outside of his home, claimed to be a suicide. There have been a lot of questions about, was it really a suicide? In fact, George Galloway just made a documentary about all of this, but it doesn't really explore the Baha'i angle at all in this documentary. I think, and I think most people who have looked at this David Kelly case have come to the conclusion that he was actually assassinated by his own government.
And Mr. Azal, was he an active Baha'i member? Or,
according to these individuals who knew him, who actually did that interview that you see in Baha'is in My Backyard, yeah, he was quite an active Baha'i.
Yes, he was quite an active Baha'i.
And so was Maya Pederson-Sadat.
And tell me about Maya Pederson, because she, out of the blue, she disappeared,
Yeah, she's disappeared. You cannot find any information on this woman. I have scoured the internet with multiple search engines to find any information about her beyond 2003. There's nothing there. And as you saw in Baha'is in My Backyard, Nama Pirates and her co-producer went on a wild goose chase trying to find her, both in Arizona and in California, and couldn't find her for an interview.
Yes, because they interviewed some American Baha'is, who were in close contact with my Pederson. And interestingly, Mr. Azal, how could they then justify the Baha'u'llah's direct instruction as to the non-involvement of the Baha'is in politics and this incident?
They don't justify it at all. But I've said this so many times in so many different ways and so many different content. All these platitudes are meaningless. They're just the gimmicks of this cult. They may apply to the rank and file lower people who are not part of the administrative, order or part of any kind of a shadow elite of this organization. But effectively, it's empty and meaningless. Because we can go through generation after generation after generation, beginning with the time of Baha'u'llah himself, even. And we see that the Baha'is are in one way or another politically involved. Even Baha'u'llah himself. Baha'u'llah's own relationship with Manakji and Mirza Malcolm Khan was an explicitly political relationship. He knew who these people were.
Is it true that Abdul Baha himself, decreed that some of the Iranian hands must find a way into the second elected parliament after constitutional revolution? Is that true?
Yeah, he was trying to get some of these people into the Iranian Majlis. Yeah.
So it's definitely it stands totally opposed, against the claim that the Baha'i are not inclined to get themselves involved in politics.
See, this is I discussed this with Stephen Bayer, about these very weird narratives about the constitutional revolution the Baha'is have pushed, including Juan Cole, I may add. The reason why Abbas Effendi initially got involved, okay, this is the thing, they realized that the Bayanis, the Azalis, were heavily involved, including in triggering the whole constitutional revolution itself, okay?
That's right, yes.
So they wanted to, it kind of became a Me Too kind of situation for Abbas Effendi. So when the constitutional revolution began, he was kind of enthusiastic about it. But then all of a sudden he realized, oh my God, these Azalis in Iran are dominating the whole scene. And they were, okay? So he immediately pulled back. Once the coup of Muhammad Ali Shah came, or just before it, when he was building up to it, Abdul Baha officially ordered all the Baha'is in Iran to pull back, and he threw his weight behind Muhammad Ali Shah. So this is the biggest irony of history, that Abbas Effendi and Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri stood on the same side against the constitution during that coup d'etat of Muhammad Ali Shah in 1909.
And 1909, and I'm sure such a statement actually exists, right?
What?
Such a statement, I'm sure these statements actually exist,
And this is, all these people in the Islamic Republic of Iran who laud and glorify Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri, which is one of the most hilarious things, when I see these films and documentaries where Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri is lionized. It makes me, I just laugh because this guy was a reactionary, but then he had the likes of Abdul Baha on the same side as him,
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's, Mr. Azal, just again, let me tell something, to the good audience of our podcast that, we Bayanis, and Mr. Razal, yourself, you're now serving as the head of, the current community of the Bayanis. We Bayanis, we are really against any sort of intimidation imposed against individual Baha'is. Yeah. And we condemned it, time and again, for instance, putting a Baha'i on the back of a donkey, wandering them around the city just to humiliate them, that gets nowhere. But I've got another question.
Sure.
Speaking of NSAs, and secret body of NSAs, that continued functioning after the official ban on the activities of the Baha'i in Iran. Could you please tell us about what is called Yahya'i Iran?
Sure. This was the ad hoc NSA of Iran that was disbanded during the last decade, particularly in 2006, 2007. Their trial occurred just before the the whole green fiasco of the summer of 2009. This was an ad hoc body, but it was effectively a National Spiritual Assembly of Iran that came about during the Khatami years. That this was an allowance the Khatami government gave to these people, to the Baha'i community of Iran. And
yes, and then they were arrested, by the way, in 2008.
Yes, they were. Yeah, and their trial happened in 2009, just before the whole summer uprising and all of that.
And again, Mr. Azal, just to the audience, these Yahya'i Iran or Friends of Iran, the current then National Spiritual Assembly like body of the Baha'is consisted of these persons.
That's right.
Mohammad Sabet,
yes.
Fariwa Kamal Abadi, Jamaluddin Khanjani,
yeah.
Afif Naimi, Saeed Rezai, Behruz Tawakkuli, and Wahid Tizfan.
Yeah.
Apparently, I just know about one, Jamaluddin Khanjani.
Mm-hmm.
That I can tell you that, beyond the shadow of a doubt, this guy is a fraud, involved, in massive fraudulent activities, financial scandals and stuff like that. And he was detained and arrested, for
yes.
Some illegal, for doing some illegal activities,
yeah.
for pushing past, some red lines, not for, being Baha'i per se.
That's right.
That's what I know about this guy. And quickly tell us about, because they were supposed to serve a life sentence, life imprisonment, but they were paroled a decade later, and let loose.
That's right.
What's going on? What's going on?
Well,
what's really going on?
This is the question, isn't it? What's going on? And this has been the question a lot of people have been asking, and the only answer is that there's been a lot of pressure from the outside, and there's active lobbies within Iran, and also certain people have been paid off within the system in Iran, to basically give leniency to these individuals over others. So there's a kind of preferential thing going on. We have been hearing, though, in recent times, that there has been, especially since the last decade, that there has been a heavy infiltration within the system of the Islamic Republic of Iran by Baha'is. Okay?
And it is interesting because on September 18, 2017,
yes.
Former President Mohammad Sabet was released and pardoned.
Yep.
2 days later, Senator John McCain, the notorious leading and pioneering figure of neocons, commented on being unified with the Baha'is, and condemning the imprisonment of the Baha'is in Iran. And that comes from, someone like John McCain.
Sure.
And let me tell you,
but
this,
nothing about union leaders, nothing about various homegrown cultural groups, people who have problems, real people with real political problems. It's just the Baha'i. So, this minuscule community, and it is minuscule. There are not 100,000 Baha'is in Iran. I don't believe that number is real.
They said 300,000.
I've heard 500,000, 200,000, 100,000, 50,000. I've heard so many different figures about the Baha'is in Iran. What can one say? So they have crafted this community as the victims. There's this term mazlum nama'i, feigning innocence, feigning victimhood.
Playing victimhood, exactly.
Where there are real victims in Iran. Let's not kid ourselves. There are real victims. Iran, is a great country. It has, there's the Islamic Republic of Iran is not Saudi Arabia. It's not even Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It is authoritarian. There are problems, but there are real victims that exist in Iran. Okay, and these people are never advocated on behalf. No one advocates on behalf of these people. Yet the Baha'is have this massive machinery of advocacy of all kinds of human rights organizations, governments, and petitions, and this, that, and the other thing. And you just wonder, what is this all about? But this is the same paradigm that we saw, before the first invasion of Iraq by the Americans, the first Gulf War, that is in 1991. The same thing that we saw during the Arab Spring, these fictitious stories about persecuted groups and minorities that then later turn out to be completely false. And the neocons, these people, the one like that Mr. Khalaji who called you and was trying to intimidate you the other day, they have, found their little thing, first with the MEK, a terrorist organization, and now the Baha'is, and they just relentlessly push these narratives, Baha'i, 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 propaganda. You go to Facebook and, other portals on like this Iran Press Watch, which is just completely pushing trash, propaganda. And these this whole site is being run by Baha'is with Baha'i money. And it's connected to a network that includes this extremely dubious Manoto TV that is relentlessly pushing anti-Iranian propaganda. Now,
exactly.
Let me emphasize something here, okay? I am a genuine pro-democracy activist, okay? But I don't believe in, these models of liberal democracy that the West has. I think, had the project of Mossadegh, his democratic nationalism, succeeded, not only Iran would be in a better place, but the whole region would be in a better place. But
that's true.
But the thing,
and by the way, Mr. Azal, sorry, by the way, you mentioned in one of your podcasts about one certain Bahram Choubine, who wrote a book about Baha'is in Mossadegh's era. We know that for sure, for certain, that quite a few Baha'is were serving in the imperial army, orchestrated the coup against Dr. Mossadegh.
That's right.
So as compelling evidence suggests, we can conclude that the Baha'is, as opposed and in contrast to what Mr. Choubine says and believes, totally against Dr. Mossadegh's doctrine.
Yes.
They were pro-Shah.
Yes, they were.
Is it true?
That's 100. Bahram Choubine is a clown. I've said this once, I'll say it again. He is a clown. And in fact, he has that picture, one of these wall post pictures of himself, painted all over in green.
And also a neocon, right?
And also a neocon. And these are the greens, from that 2009 period that have been appropriated officially by the American neocons. This guy is a clown. He's writing fiction, and trying to push it as nonfiction and historical fact. It is lies. We have the letters of Shoghi Effendi from that period that is encouraging the National Spiritual Assembly of Iran to utilize the chaos that is growing under the Mossadegh period, to cultivate relationships not with National Front, but with the royal court.
And that was not even unprecedented, because we know Abbas Effendi himself, the center of covenant, so to speak, as they call it, he was in favor of what is called in Arabic zawza. What is zawza? It's that chaos, right?
Yeah, it's
he said
zawza.
Sparking of Zoza, sparking of Zoza can benefit us a great deal.
I know some of my detractors may be listening. More certainly they are, but Alexander Dugin is a nobody compared to the kind of Zoza or chaos, theory and chaos magic that the Baha'i founders, especially Abdul Baha and his father Baha'u'llah, pursued. Dugin talks the talk. These people did it, this is what they were doing. They were encouraging the Baha'i administration in Iran to utilize situations of chaos and chaotic political atmosphere to consolidate the Baha'i political machinery.
And Mr. Azal, back into the case of.
Hold on. Let's finish this.
Oh, sorry.
About
please do go on.
And Mossadegh. The most eminent Baha'i of that period is Habib Sabet, the very person who we began talking about in this podcast.
Oh, yes.
Habib Sabet was in Rome. Okay, the moment
right.
Soraya and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Their plane hit the tarmac in Rome. Soraya and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran first for Baghdad, then for Rome. Okay,
that's right.
They did not have a penny in their pocket. Why? Because there was one coup attempt in Iran that failed, where the officers responsible for the initial coup were arrested. Okay, this was the first coup that failed. The Mossadegh government arrested these people who were responsible for it. And then a few days later, they did it again. This time it succeeded. But when that first coup attempt failed, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Soraya got on a plane, left Iran, went to Baghdad, escaped, basically fled. They fled Neo-Varan.
And Mr. Azal, by the way, this is story. This is story. Sorry, this is story. Just to the point. This is story. What you just said was also confirmed. Was also confirmed by Stephen Kinzer in All the Shahsman.
In All the Shahsman, better than that. I'll even go better than Steve Kinzer in a minute. When they came to Rome, Habib Sabet bankrolled the entire couple of days of Soraya and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi until the coup succeeded and they got on a plane and went back to Tehran. He bankrolled the whole thing, and it was as a result of this. There's a scene actually in one of the episodes of the Mu'amma Shah, which tells me that whoever the people, the screenwriters for that serial, had actually read the diaries of Habib Sabet. Habib Sabet's relatives lived on the Gold Coast in Queensland, where we lived, and one of these individuals had the fully unedited diary of Habib Sabet. Okay.
Right.
And my grandfather borrowed this from this individual and read through it. And I never forget, he used to read these various chapters because he was very interested in the coup d'etat of 1953, because he had been a university student at the time in the faculty of law. And, he told me, he said, yeah, this guy was just bragging outright, the conversations that he was having with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in the rooms and in the restaurants, and that the Shah was making to him all these promises, thank you, for all your help. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you this. I'm going to give you that. After I get back to Iran. And that's exactly what happened. And in this,
so he was bragging about hosting the Shah.
Yeah, and he was bragging. Sabet was literally in the fully unedited version of his autobiography. He was bragging about what the Shah, the conversations that he had with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in Rome.
That's and by the way, this I'd like to ask you another question about another controversial figure. Could you please examine through the case one Hozhabr Yazdani? Who was Hozhabr Yazdani, and why the Baha'i insist on declaring him a non-Baha'i?
Hozhabr Yazdani was the head of the biggest literal organized crime syndicate in the last 10-15 years of the Pahlavi regime. And this is the guy who basically had the Iranian government and the prime minister intervening in one particular situation when he tried to actually financially take over a local bank. Literally wanted to buy part of the bank, I think it was the Bank Markazi, and it was Hoveyda who stopped him from doing so. But this guy was a violent thug, and he obviously comes from that village of Sangassad. And this Sangassad, it's come up a few times now in these podcasts, is a town in Semnan province where, that's right, Semnan, right?
That's right, yes, absolutely.
And all of the peoples of this town are Baha'is. There is no such thing as a non-Baha'i Sangassari. Okay,
and they are very devoted, right?
If you wanted to be a non-Baha'i, you went to Shah Mirzad, which was the adjoining town, the rival town to Sangassad. This really Cosa Nostra, Italian-style, violent, kind of mafia took over basically the entire underworld during the last 10-15 years of the Pahlavi regime. And they had access to the royal court. They also had access to the royal court through people like Abdul Karim Ayadi, who was from Sangassad himself, and other individuals who were directly connected to the court. These people have been accused.
Mansour Rouhani
was another one. They were accused for all kinds of murders and killings and extortions, and Mario Puzo couldn't keep up with what this guy was up to.
By the way, Mr. Azal, this Hozhabr Yazdani, let me just tell you that, as you may well know, he was beyond the assassination of Teymur Bakhtiar, the first deputy of Secret Police.
I have heard that it was that Savak actually contracted, just as many intelligence agencies contract organized crime in many situations, that they contracted the particular syndicate of Hozhabr Yazdani, and that they were responsible for the murder of Teymur Bakhtiar in Iraq. Yes, I've read about this in a couple of different places. Anyway, after the revolution, he gets arrested, and then manages to buy his way out of prison, and then comes out of Iran and goes to Costa Rica. And this is in the 80s, early 80s. Yeah, he goes to Costa Rica, and he basically tried the same stunt that he had tried, in Iran when Hoveyda was still premier. But this time it backfired. He tried to buy a bank, and it backfired. And the financial corruption involved in that situation was so blatant that it forced the hand of the UHJ. So they basically excommunicated him, more as a kind of as a face-saving measure than anything else. But this guy is a Baha'i, was a Baha'i. His whole family were Baha'is. But interestingly enough, for his funeral, when he died, and this was back during the last decade, I had a back and forth with his daughter on the old Iranian.com site, and she claimed that her father had converted to Islam. But if you look at the videos of the funeral, it is so contrived, and it's the daughter reading, at a funeral you're supposed to read Al-Fatiha and Yasin. These are the surahs of the Quran that Muslims usually read for funerals. This daughter, without any hijab, is not an alima, is reading Surah Al-Ikhlas, the 112th surah of the Quran, as evidence that her father has converted to Islam. Now, I heard, and this is all, this is all conjecture, these are all rumors, that the reason that this was done is because she was trying to acquire properties and estates that belonged to her father that under the law of the Islamic Republic of Iran would bar her as a Baha'i from acquiring. So this was like a kind of a demonstration so that then she could go and acquire these properties and what happened.
So similar to the case we talked about in the last
podcast,
about Shoghi Effendi.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And Mr. Azal, please also tell me a bit about another suspicious figure. He made a very suspicious presence during, Pahlavi era, namely Abdul Karim Ayyadi. He was a really incompetent physician, without any intellectual, capabilities. But he was apparently in charge of almost everything related to the Shahs and his personal affairs.
Yeah, he was. He. Some have said that this is the man that basically killed the Shah because of his misdiagnosis, and the cocktails of drugs and things that he put Mohammad Reza Pahlavi on over a period of 30 plus years.
That's right.
He had been introduced apparently to the royal court in last years of Reza Shah. There's that scene in the very first couple of episodes of Muammar Shah where Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Reza Shah are walking down Niavaran, and the father is telling his son, look, there's only one group of people that you can trust here, and these are the Baha'is, and we owe these people, so keep it sweet with them. I actually took that segment of that and put it on my YouTube. You can actually find it. The Baha'is tried to take that segment of the video down, and they were spamming it, etc. Anyway, it's still there. But this apparently actually happened, that Reza Shah told Mohammad Reza Pahlavi before his abdication that the only people that you could trust to keep you safe and keep this monarchy together as long as you treat them well are the Baha'is.
And because Mr. Azal, as you said, as you also pointed out previously in your articles, in your podcast, upon the abdication of Reza Shah, Abdul Karim Ayyadi was introduced to Muhammad Reza Shah through another prominent Baha'i, namely General Sani'i.
Yes.
Is that true?
That's right. Through General Sani'i, it was how the introductions were made for Ayyadi to Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. That's correct. Yes.
And what did he do thereafter?
He became basically the Shah's personal physician at the royal palace. He was basically
confident.
And confidant, yeah. Those segments, for example, in the Muammar Shah, this series has been very widely criticized, but there's, from what I have read, there's a lot of accuracies as well. This guy was responsible for procuring women for Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was all kinds of drugs and whatnot. This was the go-to man. If the Shah wanted something, he went to Ayyadi, and Ayyadi could find it. And if he couldn't find it in the legal market, Ayyadi could find it in the black market. So this is how why the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, kept this guy as long as he did.
Besides, Mr. Azal, there is a very interesting source. That here I really call out, the authorities in Iran, to republish it again. It was the memoirs of one of the Shah's mistress by the name of, she was Farrokh Ghaffari, Parveen Ghaffari, sorry. Parveen Ghaffari was the Shah's mistress, one of very beloved mistress, and with whom Shah, launched an affair, a relatively long affair, and she says in that memoir that was, again, unfortunately banned, for reasons unknown to me at least. He says Abdul Karim Ayyadi was literally a procurer. You know,
he was a pig, basically. Yeah.
Yes, he procured, you know, women for the Shah, and you know, ironically speaking, took the leftover, you know, for himself, including this very Miss Parveen Ghaffari, you know, who wrote down, you know, her own memories of the Shah, and it is very interesting because in the Baha'i writing in the scriptures, you know, having illegal, you know, intimate relationships with other women, with married women, are strictly forbidden, you know. But we see these kind of people, because there is no way, Mr. Azal, do you agree? There is no way to declare Abdul Karim Ayyadi a non-Baha'i. He was the son of one of the hands. Is that true?
Yes,
That's why he chose and adopted the family name
Ayyadi.
of Ayyadi.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. So there is no way, you know, to consider him a non-Baha'i or Aghyar, you know, as they say.
Let me tell you about all these quote-unquote strategic Aghyar that the Baha'i administration claimed. One of the most prominent, obviously, is Parviz Sabeti. You know, anybody who was an insider in the Iranian Baha'i community of the 1960s and 70s knows this guy and his whole entire family were Baha'is. Okay? But because of the Savat connection and because this became quite a sensitive issue, you know, I don't know what got into whose head, but ever since Parviz Sabeti left Iran, first himself and then the Baha'i administration have claimed that he's a non-Baha'i. But this is impossible, you know, given the family connections. And Parviz Sabeti is saying that, you know, he's also related to Ayyadi, related to some of the Hozhabr Yazdani and all of these other people. These people are all related to each other.
That's right. And Parviz Sabeti, as we know, Mr. Parviz Sabeti committed so many crimes, you know, during his deputy, you know, serving as deputy of secret police service, Savat, the notorious secret police. And by the way, Mr. Azal, I'm going to tell you the story, you know, I've got from at least two different and distinct reliable sources. I'm going to ask you your take on this story, you know, about what I'm saying, okay? Are you with me?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. That's going to be probably my final question for you. Back into the topic of, you know, secret national spiritual assemblies or Yahya'i Iran, you know, I heard from the sources that Mahvash Sabet, you know, rose to prominence. Actually, she made a name after being detained. She was arrested for some simple reason. According to the sources, you know, a girl in Mashhad, based in Mashhad, you know, started speaking up her wish and her willing to withdraw from the Baha'i administration, the Baha'i, you know, fists, ziyafat, you know, firesides, and by far and large, she decided, you know, to renounce her faith in Baha'u'llah, you know, you know, considering Baha'u'llah as a usurper and a fraud. Mahvash Sabet, you know, was deployed to Mashhad in order, you know, to intimidate, dissuade, you know, and threaten the girl in question. she did her own best. She tried her own best, to convince the girl, to keep her mouth shut. And apparently, that is the reason she was trapped and haunted by, the intelligent officers, because she was intimidating somebody, she was intimidating a citizen. And it is a personal decision not to be a Baha'i. Mr. Azal, as a scholar, as the leader of the community of the Bayanis, and also a watchful observer, when you were a teenager, how is it possible? How likely it is that this story has some root in fact?
The probability is probably 99.9%. These things happen this way. The circumstances of this particular case that you're talking about are not completely clear to me. I have vaguely heard about it, but the patterns are very similar and very well known. This is how they do these things. Yeah.
So that's how they handle, these sort of things. And finally, Mr. Azal, would you please tell us about, just briefly, about the request, put forward by the Bayani community, for the surrender of the Baha'is in order, to give them a signal, in order to give them a chance, in order to give them, an opportunity to remain true to themselves, to start remaining true to themselves.
I have put this, I put several challenges. I'll put another challenge up here to the UHJ, is that, in a sense, we're dealing with a kind of an archetypal situation of Pharaoh, who is taking these poor, average rank-and-file Baha'is hostage to an ideology. And these are innocent people, they are well-intentioned people, but they are misled and they're being used. And that the universal of justice needs to allow these people to go, to go their own way, to stop manipulating their lives, stop pushing wedges through the lives of people because it wants to keep its organizational intact. So, maybe I'm the return of Moses in this particular situation, and I'm telling the Pharaoh that is the universal house of justice, let my people go. Leave these people alone. Let them live their lives in peace.
Because don't you think that the governments, particularly the Western governments, should pick it up very quickly? Should take notice of this point.
Absolutely, they should take notice of this point.
Mr. Houshmand Fatah Azam, who served as a member of Universal House of Justice, for over probably 30 years ago or so, he said, to some of the Baha'is that when we take power, when we ascend power in Iran, we are going to have all dissidents,
yes,
all covenant breakers, all Azalis imprisoned, yes, and 7 Baha'i bars.
Yes.
That's, that's very obvious, It doesn't take a rocket scientist
these people are fascists.
Figure it out.
They are a criminal mafia. They're not nice people. Anybody who thinks that you're dealing with nice people, they throw these average Baha'is, into the face of the camera so everybody thinks, oh, these are really nice, soft, sheepy kind of people, But the real people who run the Haifan Baha'i faith, these are criminals, these people.
And what is your final assessment of the current situation of Baha'is worldwide?
I think the actual on-the-ground situation is not good at all, despite all the public relations. I mean, the news I hear from Australia is that they have no enrollments. I hear the same thing about the United States and Canada as well. But because these neoconservatives see a use in these people, they are, basically crafting a media narrative about them, or at least about their elites, and basically using them as the crutch, as the way in to try to destabilize the system in Iran, to topple it, especially now with these new sanctions that Trump has put back on Iran. That is, in fact, destabilizing Iran at a very rapid rate, I might add. So, this is what's really going on. But the average Baha'i, the average American Baha'i, the average European Baha'i, the average Australian Baha'i, people on the ground, they're not running anything, and they're also, the organization itself is not really attracting new blood. These are the same old people, same old networks of people that have been around for the last 20, 30 years or so.
Right. And Mr. Azal, as you said, this is the last podcast of the first season about, the Baha'ism, because you've already started another project.
Yep.
And we are not going to have another podcast, probably until after 6 weeks.
Yeah, until
later.
Probably around, as we're getting close to the spring Nowruz period, or even maybe earlier than that, we'll basically close. Before. Sure, go ahead.
Okay, before getting to the end and finalizing, the first season.
Before we finalize the first season, I want to say one thing, I'm addressing now the UHJ, the Universal House of Justice, and these counselors. Okay, have honor. Okay. Have honor. Remember my 19 terms and conditions for your unconditional surrender. If you have any honor, take the keys to your Baha'i World Center and the shrines tomorrow, and hand them over to the Haifa City Council, and go home. Okay.
Right.
That's all you need to do. Hand the keys of the shrines, the Baha'i gardens, the UHJ. Hand them over to the Haifa City Council and go home.
That's it.
That's it.
As simple as it. And two really short questions, Mr. Azal. Actually, they are kind of related. As you know, back in 2011, two Iranian movie makers, visionaries, and directors, namely Mohsen Makhmalbaf, and Reza Allamezadeh, made two long documentaries, about the Baha'is. The first one made by Allamezadeh, entitled The Iranian Taboo, and the second one entitled The Gardener by Mohsen Makhmalbaf.
Yeah, I know.
What's your take on this?
My take on this, I couldn't watch more than 5 minutes of either one of these documentaries, to be honest.
I see.
Especially the one by Makhmalbaf. I mean, I had to, that Hamid Dawashi wrote 2 books on Makhmalbaf, and made Makhmalbaf basically the cinematic Christ of Iranian film, and even he couldn't stand this anymore. Once Makhmalbaf made that Gardner documentary, the Iranian Taboo, I only saw 5 minutes of it. It's interesting that you can't find it on YouTube. It's not even, you can't access it on YouTube. You have to actually buy it, the whole thing, to be able to see it.
That's right. And interestingly, it was made by some Marxist Stalinist, Mr. Reza Allamezadeh.
I don't think Allamezadeh is a Stalin. I think he's a Trotskyist. Actually.
Sorry, Trotskyist. Yes. The Stalin, a Marxist Trotskyist, Mr. Reza Allamezadeh. Why would a Trotskyist want to make a movie about the Baha'is. Why would he care?
For the same reason why and Trotskyists like Christopher Hitchens would become a neoconservative. The Trots are the are the schizophrenics of the world of Marxism, as we all know very well.
However, Mr. Azal, as you might agree, I should say, based on my personal search, I craft the internet. None of these movies actually went down very well with the Iranian audience. I don't know why, but they were not perceived, very well, and they did not get, positive reviews either.
I wonder why, with my tongue firmly in my cheek. I mean, look, people are not stupid, okay? These are the same talking points that they have been pushing since the 1930s, okay? And they're making the same predictions, and they're making the same thrust for power, and they've done the same thing over and over again. Guys, the party's over. Hand the keys over to the Haifan Municipal Council and go home, And
Mr. Azal, thank you very much indeed, for taking part in this podcast. And could you please tell us where the audience could probably find the 19 terms, statements?
I will put a link in the description box to the 19 terms and conditions.
Thank you very much. That was a pleasure. Hope to see you. Hope to hear more from you. And here, I'm going to repeat it to the audience that, inshallah, by will of God, we will, continue making the next season of these podcasts about Baha'ism, Iran, and political affairs. Thank you very much, Mr. Azal.
Thank you. God bless.
Bye. God bless.